9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 27. Burning Embers. There was nothing but blackness. She would never be able to tell if it was a minute or millennia that she was trapped in this world where war was a fable and pain was a myth. This was a world where dreams existed, the most intense longings of the heart, the deepest abyss she could have fallen to. Seven felt so lost. Many times, over and over, she kept dreaming that Nine was still walking up to her. She was smiling, her favorite crooked smile, arms outstretched. He was unharmed and alive. Seven would run towards him, relieved that he was still with her. She would wrap her arms around him while he would quietly tell her that everything was fine and not to be afraid. Then when Seven looked up at him, there would be nothing. She was hugging empty air. He didn't come back to her. He was already gone. Seven suddenly snapped back into reality. She was immediately aware of a deep aching coursing through her body. The female Stitchpunk stared upwards for a moment, before closing her eyes once more, breathing heavily. She tried to regain her bearings as she calmed down, the ache in her body quieting as she willed herself to relax. Seven then rolled over slowly and struggled to sit up. Looking around, she realized that she was lying in some sort of makeshift gurney, on top of a soft flannel sheet. Someone had graciously folded and tied to a wooden bed. She was covered in a piece of soft, thick gray fabric. She sighed softly, rubbing her pounding head. Seven then slowly lowered her head and took at her ripped arm. It was completely cleaned and healed, re-sewn with a dark gray thread. Seven sighed again, dropping her arm and looking up. She was in a room where the Stitchpunks had slept the night before they had defeated the machines. Seven blinked, suddenly realizing that there was no longer any machines. They had won the war, and they were finally safe. Their world still dangerous, but the most peaceful it had been in over a decade. As she realized this, Seven also realized the price they had to pay for their freedom. It had taken him away. A sudden wave of devastating grief crashed over her. Seven bent her head, unable to wrap her mind around what had happened. They had been so close to winning the war, making it through together until that last moment. The machine had taken one final life, one final victory. Seven swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her feet making a small clicking noise as they touched the smooth wooden floor. Seven slowly got to her feet, making sure she had her balance, and took a hesitant step. She didn't collapse or sway, which were both good signs. Seven then walked out of the room into the drawing room. Looking around, all was silent, and she saw no one else, wondering where the other Stitchpunks were. Seven suddenly stopped walking as she looked upon the large window set in the corner of the room. Overlooking the courtyard, two ragdolls were silhouetted against the early gray light shining through the windows. They were bent over the dark shape of another makeshift gurney. Seven blinked, realizing who was lying on the cot. She walked forward, approaching the window. Two was sitting beside the cot, his head in his hands. He looked older than ever. His frail, tired body bent over. Five was standing, bending over the lightless figure on the bed. He was tenderly cleaning the mud and the dirt off of Nine's broken body, using a damp, soft cloth to clean his optics. His eyes remained closed as if he was sleeping. I brought the cloth carefully over the cracking glass of Nine's right optic. He looked absolutely miserable as he cleaned his empty form. The grief hung heavily in the air as the two looked over the body of the young Stitchpunk. 7? 2 spoke quietly, looking up. He must have heard 7's footsteps as she approached. 5 looked up as well. He and 7 shared glances, each reading the grief of each other's faces. 5 took a few steps away, allowing her space to come to 9. 7 then looked away and walked forward, sitting on one of the bobbins they had been using for chairs as she looked over his limp form. 9's hands were resting on his chest, the burn over his zipper sewn shut. 7 looked over 9 quickly, reaching forward and wrapping her fingers around his hand. 7 held it tightly, covering it with both her own. It felt like it was coated with ice. 7 wished with her entire being that he would be here, hold her hand back. But she knew he never would again. His body was very cold, and it chilled 7's entire arm. She didn't move away, however. Instead, she bent over and rested her forehead against his. Her optics clanged lightly against his, her heart broken. 9, her 9, was dead. Dear 7, my dear girl, it's alright. It's going to be alright. 2 consoled her, sitting beside her and rubbing her back soothingly. 5 stood beside him, watching 7 bend over 9 miserably. 2 continued to rub her back, speaking softly. I know you miss him. It's alright. 7's eyes then opened and she sat up. 2's words echoed in her mind as she realized that, for once in his life, the old inventor was wrong. Gently sitting 9's head down onto his chest, his hands. 7 stood and turned away from him, walking away briskly. She had one and only one mission now. She wouldn't let anything stop her. 2 suddenly realized that 7 was walking towards the front door, down the hallway. Wait! 7! 2 walked after her as he grabbed his cane, struggling to his feet and hobbling after her. 5 stood and looked after them. 7 paused and looked over her shoulder at 2 just as 1 appeared by her side. He looked fatigued and careworn, looking older than he has ever had before. Alerted by all the noise, the old Stitchpunk looked down at the younger woman. What is she doing? 1 asked 2 snappishly at the other elder, looking at 7's hand. The elder took 7's hand, holding tightly and looking up at her in an anxious confusion. She's trying to leave, 2 cried, glancing at 1, then back at 7. His gentle middle fingers tightened around hers. He's trapped. I'm not gonna let him sit there in the talisman forever. I have to set him free, 7 said flatly, pulling her hand out of 2's grasp. No, 7, you're still weak. You can't. Please, my dear. I don't want to see you hurt again, 2 said softly, imploring her. 7, his soul is gone. The talisman is destroyed. His soul along with it. I'm sorry, 1 said gently, his tone a tone she had never heard from the old man. 7 tore her gaze from 2 and 1. Her brows furrowed. I'm going. He can't be gone. He's trapped, just like you 2 were, she said to the 2 elders, undaunted in her mission. 7, you've been asleep for days. You cannot go out in this weakened state. I know he was right, and I'm sorry for doubting him. I will forever deeply regret being the man that I was to him. But it would be a waste of time, and you cannot get anyone any more hurt than you currently are, Seven. 9 is gone. One contradicted, his grizzled old voice increasing in strength, although a hint of great remorse passed across his face. Seven froze. She had once said that saving them was a waste of time, and yet he had risked it all to save them, for the world to be from the world between. She would never forget the grief and relief 9 had felt in his ordeal. He's worth it. He came after you, and you're all alive. I tried to stop him, but he went anyway. I said things that really hurt him. But look at you now. You all got your second chance. He made sure you weren't trapped. I'm doing the same for him. He isn't gone. I know you're wrong. I'm going to free him, she said, turning away slowly, walking away once more. The two elders watched as she walked away in silence. Two looked at the young woman with soft, understanding golden eyes, understanding what she felt. You loved him, Two murmured gently, realization dawning upon his face. Within the statement, there was no question. It was understanding and knowing. One's gaze shot up at Seven in disbelief. Seven blinked, her eyes still fixed instantly on the dead world ahead. She bit her lower lip, her hands curled into fists. The statement tore at her heart, at her very soul. In those moments, she realized that Two had spoken nothing but the truth. She was finally allowing herself to believe it, to accept it. She had fallen in love with 9. Yes, Two, she murmured. I do. 7 then sprinted forward through a small hole in the huge wooden door into the cold gray morning. 1 and 2 watched her as she disappeared into the eerie mist. 1 shook his head sadly. 5 watched as 7 ran out the door, disappearing into the misty emptiness. His heart fell as 7's words reached him, and he could only stand, staring after her. She finally opened up enough to admit that she loved the now lifeless Stitchpunk lying beside him. And he died without ever hearing 7 say those words to him. 5 knew that he would be bewildered, ecstatic, baffled, and full of joy to know that his feelings were recuperated. But now, poor 7 had been left alone. She lost the man who had opened and healed her heart. 5 turned and looked down towards the gurney. It was deathly quiet as he sat back down beside 9, reaching forward and taking his still hand. He held it gently, bending his head. After they arrived back home after the horrific night, 5 had left his brother to heal 7 and look over the others. He comforted them and told them it was going to be all right. He knew that 9 would have done. He knew that's what 9 would have done. Stayed strong for his family. When 5 finally returned to his side and looked over his broken and bedraggled body, he broke. He broke hard. He didn't even leave 9's side for hours, sobbing until he was exhausted. 2 came up and wrapped his arms around him, quietly murmuring words of comfort. 5 couldn't help keep the horrific memory of the deadly lights tearing 9's strong, brave soul from his body away. He hadn't been there to try to save his friend, to help him get away from the machine before it seized him. 5 knew he would never forgive himself for allowing 9 to go off alone. The mechanic sighed, bringing 9's hand to his chest. His chin quivered as he extended his free hand, resting on the top of his lifeless Stitchpunk's head. There seemed to be a huge hole in his heart, A huge piece of his being that left him. 9 had been his best friend, little brother. He had so much to show him, to teach him. There had been a future for them that was no more. All he could do now was miss him. He could only hope that 7 would be able to find the talisman, that his soul wasn't destroyed, and that he would be able to say goodbye. 7 sprinted through the mist, never once stopping. She easily retraced her coven steps through the rocky, dead forest. Her aching joints begged for relief, but she ignored the pleas. She passed the remains of the citadel and headed down to the field, the dead grass completely limp from the rain and the mist. Navigating her way through the rocks, 7 finally made it into the field that marked the end of the emptiness and the entrance to the barrens. It was devastated. There were several interlocked bands of black ash from the oil fire 9 had started that terrible night. Damp gray cinders covered everything, every last blade of grass. Though the light drizzled in heavy mist, 7 finally saw it. The body of the fabrication machine was burned beyond recognition. He was lying silent and desolate in the village of the Embers, like a large iron mountain. The fire and the explosion from the orb had mutilated melted the iron body, curling huge bands of metal, snapping each delicate wire and completely destroying the central system the scientists had created. It was covered in ashes and dew. Spindly arms sprawled out around it. As 7 walked around it slowly, several different emotions battled within her. It had taken 9 away from her, and it left her heart in shambles. Her coven in ruins. She looked away from the machine. She had no reason to fear it any longer. He was never coming back now. She knew that the talisman must have been nearby where she found 9's body. 7 looked under each rock, behind every blade of grass. Suddenly, something glinted out of the corner of her eye. Whirling around, 7 managed to spot a familiar metallic surface, blending easily with the dull colors of the burnt field. She ran to the glint, her heart pounding in relief. As she came up to a small metallic object hidden in the remaining grass, she sank to her knees weakly. The talisman was covered in ashes and dew, streaked with burns and scratches. 7 gingerly picked it up, running her fingers over the engraved plates. The scraping noises seemed as loud as a thunderclap in the silence. Grief thoroughly overwhelmed 7 as she stared at the object, now containing 9's soul. She held the talisman to her heart. Both hands covered it, protecting it. Her lower lip trembled as she sat there in the ashes, holding the one she loved close to her broken heart. 9, I'm here. It's me. It's 7. I promise I'll get you out. Just hold on a bit longer. I promise. She whispered to the talisman, wishing that he could hear her. Her lips brushing the top of the talisman, she bent over it, weeping softly, alone in the barrens. Nobody could hear her. She wished with her entire being that he knew his 7 was there, that she had come to free him. Her emotional shield was completely gone, and she allowed herself to cry for just a few moments before she realized she could sit here no longer. 2 was right. She was extremely weak. She needed to go home. Holding the talisman closer still to her chest, she got to her feet, and without a second glance at the body of the machine, she ran back towards the city in her mission to get home. 7 was oblivious to the feeble, fleeting glow of the talisman symbols. He knew she was there. End of chapter 27.